You have what we call an information need.
Don't show me the list of links. Just send me to the most relevant link that you've got.
When you search at Google, you're not actually searching the web. You're searching a copy of the web.
I had no idea. Hello, world, and welcome to the Tech Overflow podcast. I'm Hannah Clayton-Langton.
And I'm Hugh Williams, and we are the podcast that explains technology to curious people.
Curious people indeed. How are you doing today, Hugh?
I am well, Hannah. I am well. How about you?
I am looking forward to my ski trip next week. I'm still into this idea, we've been talking about it offline, of like sport overflow, or like you guys tell us what sectors or industries do you want overflow on? Because you can, once you start thinking of it, you're like, oh, I could do everything overflow.
Sport overflow would be good, or vinyl record overflow maybe.
Well, I'm not too educated in either. I would know less about sports than I do about tech. So that gives me another one for the listeners. Speaking of tech, we've got a super cool topic today, and one of which I think you are pretty much a master, which is Google search.
I can't wait to talk about this. How does Google search actually work? And I think this will be fun.
I think it's going to be great. And just to remind us of your credentials. So you worked for Google, although mostly on Google Maps, I think, but you also spent a lot of time at Microsoft on Bing, which is a competitor search engine to Google search. Is that right?
I'll be very honest. I mean, I haven't really used Bing since I left Microsoft. I think Google's a better search engine. We can talk about why later on.
Yeah, we definitely should.
But the set of people who built Google and are still building Google, and the set of people who built Bing and are still building Bing are, the same crowd. And people move between those two companies. So, lots of the same things happening, but one big victor in Google search.
And not to take us too far off track at the beginning, but is there like a geographical component? Like is Bing bigger in certain geographies?
I don't think so.
Okay. So Google just has like 90% market share everywhere.
Yeah, at least.
For now.
At least.
We can talk about that later.
Yeah.
How ChatGPT is changing the game. Okay. And I guess Ask Jeeves isn't around that much anymore. I think I'm kind of aging myself. But I remember back in the 90s, at least in the US where I was living, Ask Jeeves was another competitor web search engine.
Yeah, there were a lot in the 90s. If you sort of wind back the clock to kind of the mid-90s, I mean, there was Alta Vista, InfoSeek, Excite, Ask Jeeves, Look Smart. I mean, there was a long list of, mid to late 90s search engines, and they pretty much all faded away. Of course, Yahoo had their own search engine.
Yeah.
They pretty much all faded away when Google took away all their market share. And obviously, a little bit later on after Google was founded, they came up with their incredible ads business and became the first company to really make money out of search. And, the rest, as they say, is history.
Well, I've been reflecting a little bit on the history of the internet for prep for some of this season. And I remember when the internet was called the information superhighway. Like, I don't know that it's really called that anymore, but there was a sign up at my school library that was citing the internet as the information superhighway. Because before we were using it for like literally everything, and we had apps for everything. It was a place where you went to seek out information.
Yeah, absolutely. You used to go to Yahoo's directory and follow all those links to find web pages you were interested in. Search was pretty reasonable, and there were a bunch of very, very popular sites like nasa.gov that we all used to go and marvel at the pictures that Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 would take. And if we take a flashback back to episode 1 of season 1.
Somewhere, yeah. I mean, I can't say that I was intellectual enough in the 90s. To be fair, guys, I was between the ages of 0 and 9 in the 90s, but I was definitely not on nasa.gov or whatever you just said, but you were definitely smart enough to be using that. Okay, and throwback even further, before we had web search, we had encyclopedias. So it was a pretty big advent of new technology. I'm sure the quality of the results the improvement over time and the continued improvement is massive, but that was a huge game changer. Like, type in anything and get back information.
Yeah, absolutely. And, get back 10 relevant blue links in, 200 milliseconds or so, 1/5 of a second. Lots of infrastructure powering, pretty relevant, very, very fast search results.
Pretty cool. Okay, so let's start at the basics. Like, talk me through how you as an expert would describe a search engine, or like the why if we take a product lens on search.
Yeah, good place to start, Hannah. So I think probably the best way to think about it is maybe just think about how you think about using search, right? So I think you walk up to your favorite search engine, Google, and you have in mind something that you want to figure out. So you've got what we'd call in the field of information retrieval, which is what this broad field's called, you have what we call an information need. So I know you were talking about getting a holiday to Florence.
Yeah, I never actually been, but I'll manifest it.
Yeah, maybe you'll do this on ChatGPT now, but let's pretend you're doing it on Google. You've got in mind a wonderful holiday, the amount of time you want to go, who you want to go with, where you want to stay, time of year you're thinking about going. I mean, you've got a big complex information need in your head. You've got a price point, all kinds of stuff. And you walk up to Google, you type something into their search box, the median query. So if you take all the queries and sort them from the shortest query to the longest query, and you look at the one that's sitting there in the middle is 2 words. So you're probably typing Florence holidays.
Yeah, cheap hotels or, I don't know, fancy hotels or something.
Yeah, users are learning to type longer queries now, I think probably because of things like ChatGPT and because they're starting to ask more questions of Google and get better answers. But the queries are pretty short, right? So you got this complex need in your head and you turn up in 2 words, maybe 3, and you press enter, and then 200 milliseconds later, what Google is trying to do is it's trying to come up with answers to this complex information need that you've got in your head, right? And that's a hard project, right? So you've only given it 2 or 3 words describing this very complex idea that you've got, and you're giving Google, 1/5 of a second to come up with answers that it thinks might be reasonable. But the problem it's trying to solve is you've got an information need, it's got a vast repository of resources it could show you, and what it's trying to do is read your mind.
Yeah.
Really try and figure out what is that information need that sits under this 2-word query and do its best very, very quickly to give you answers that you can click on or see on the screen these days. There's a lot of that going on that meet your information need and help you progress with this task that you're carrying on.
I'm surprised that the median search is only 2 words. That really surprises me.
Yeah, and the mean average would be, still under 3.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
It's mad though, the vast array of different things that I might just pop into Google. Like, especially nowadays, we all have smartphones. You're like fact checking stuff that comes up in conversation or like literally Googling something as someone's talking about it. So yeah, it can literally be anything.
Yeah. And look, a typical user probably runs 4 to 5 queries a day. So people are, using it pretty frequently, probably not as frequently as they're using, say, their social media, but, they're using it pretty frequently. And, Google's probably getting, let's say, pretty close to 100,000 queries a second.
Wow.
From across the world, many, many trillions of queries a year. So there's lots of people out there. Most people on the planet use it. Most people on the planet use it several times a day, and, all sorts of stuff getting poured into it.
Well, 90% market share is crazy for anything, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One day in the future, maybe it's in season 4 or something, we should talk about monopolies in tech and those kinds of things. And certainly there's a lot of people who, are concerned about big tech and monopolistic kind of behavior. But Google's won the game, right?
But they've won it for like 20 years, more, nearly 30, right? I think we were talking the other day, and they've been around since 1998.
Yeah, exactly.
And they've been dominant for surely most of that period.
Yeah.
In search.
All of that period, really. They took off and they've never been challenged, really. I mean, we had a real shot at it at Microsoft. Microsoft's still trying. But they're a tough competitor and very, very good at what they do. And maybe if we just go back to that launch date, way back in the late 90s, you might sort of go, well, what did they actually release and why did it sort of crush everybody else? And I'd say, look, everybody remembers the super clean interface.
Yeah.
The interfaces of the search engines that preceded it were pretty cluttered and ugly. They had banner ads at the top. These were big, messy, horrible interfaces. Google launched something that was mostly white. They had the cool Google logo with the multicolor logo and was clean. It was also very, very fast. And so, you were astounded at the time how fast Google could answer your questions. And then they did a killer thing, which I think has been lost to history a little bit, which is they would summarize the documents that were the answers and just show you where the words you typed in existed within the document, which we call query bias summaries, if you want to get into the technical terms. But nobody else before them had done that. So what the old search engines used to do was they just show you the first paragraph or so from whatever web page it was. And so you'd look at this blue link and you'd wonder, why is this here? Why is this relevant to me? And then Google was smart enough to show you the parts of the document that actually mattered. And so suddenly their search results page, looked just super, super relevant to the user. And you're like, hey, this is a way better experience. It's cleaner, it's faster, the page looks really relevant to me. And they didn't put banner ads all over the thing.
They also did that fun thing where, well, they still do it, of course, where on certain days of the year, or like whether they're historical or like for the Olympics, they'll have like a fun animation on the Google logo or something.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
used to be like at work, you'd be like, oh, have you seen, maybe less so now.
Yeah,
maybe I'm doing more meaningful work than I was when I first started.
Yeah, and we don't go to the Google homepage like we used to.
Yeah.
We always used to go to google.com to start our searches. But most of the time these days, we just go to our browser and in the address bar, we type in a query and press enter. So you're kind of bypassing the Google homepage these days. And then obviously it's often embedded into other products that you might be using. So you kind of miss seeing the logo.
Yeah, because I'm in Chrome. I'm a huge Google Enterprise fan. We don't need to go into that now, but I will give them some free marketing. When I'm punching stuff into my Chrome tab search bar, I assume that that's linked to Google because it's a Google product.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We should do an episode on Chrome at some point. I've got a couple of friends who worked on Chrome in the early days, and we could talk a lot about Chrome.
Okay, I can give them my effusive praise. Yeah. And Google have axed the I'm feeling lucky button, right? Haven't they?
Yeah, they have. They have. Long gone now, I think. It was a cool idea at the time, just sort of send you to a random web page.
So the idea was like, don't show me the list of links, just send me to the most relevant link that you've got. And I mean, it's the name is self-evident. It's like putting your trust in them to direct your search to the most relevant place.
Yeah. And I think if you really believed, if you were working at Google, that you had the most relevant search engine and you were more often than not getting it right, then I think you'd have the courage to put that on the homepage and give people a way to shortcut past the search results page.
And they must have been forgoing ad revenue or something. Is that why they removed it?
I think they did it before they had an ads business. And then, it was a pretty cute, popular feature. And I'm guessing at some point they removed it because either A, it wasn't being used, or B, they were forgoing ad revenue. Yeah. And I think they've become more and more about revenue over the years. But certainly when they started it, they were real purists. I mean, they didn't have an ads business and they just wanted to deliver a great search product.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's talk about the great search product and maybe come back to ads later if we have time. Can I just ask the original search? So I'm like, again, belying my age range here very, very much. But I used to get taught at school like how you Google stuff, and it would be like put the words that you want together in quotation marks and then like a plus sign and the other thing you want in the results board. And sometimes you could put like a minus sign of the words you didn't. Does that work? We're past those days?
That all still works. So you can certainly use these, what we call advanced query operators in Google. You've come up with some good examples, quotation marks, the plus, the minus sign, all still works. I'd say though today, and it's probably been true for the whole history of Google, is, only the very advanced users know about those features.
Oh, well, that was me in 6th grade. So I've obviously been advanced in my tech use for a long time.
You're definitely a top 1%. You're definitely a top 1%. I'd say, the history of me working on search at least is, I work with these young, smart product managers and they'll have some advanced idea like that. And I'll kind of look at them and I'll say, look, you're gonna ship this thing out to customers and way less than 1% of the customers are going to use it. And they look at me and say, no, this is a fantastic feature. I'm going to do thumbs up, thumbs down on the results and we'll get all this feedback. And then they usually come back 6 months later and say, yeah, you were kind of right. Nobody uses advanced features. So I think people just expect to be able to type the words simply into the search box, press enter and get amazing results in a fifth of a second.
Okay, so we're not looking at developing our use through new additional features. We just want the same thing we've wanted since the beginning of Google's arrival, which is relevant results.
Yep.
Okay.
That's it. And look, there's certainly some features that they've added over time, like auto suggest, for example.
Yes.
I was kind of part of the auto suggest wars between Yahoo, Bing and Google, and we're all innovating in that. But it's a very standard feature these days you'll find in most search engines. And obviously that helps you a lot. You might type in a couple of words and you might see in the drop down a query that's better than the query you're going to type, and you click on that, or it's a fast way to complete the query. And so there's some advanced features like that I think save users typing, and therefore they will use them, or help users express their information need in a better way, and therefore they will use them. But people don't like plus, minus, and quotation marks.
No, but one thing that makes me very lazy in how I type, particularly on my phone, is did you mean? Is that what it's called? Did you mean? Yep. Where you put in like an egregious typo and it still knows what you meant to type.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're getting better and better and better at that. So these days it's much better at just quietly correcting the mistakes that you've made, given that's context about you and the vast experience they have and the teams that work on that. And so these days, you don't see as much did you mean as probably you did 15 years ago. Okay. But it's an incredibly cool feature.
Yeah, it is. But although it does allow me to be very lazy. Okay, so how is it working under the hood if I am typing in holiday to Florence? What's it pulling from?
Yeah, good question. So the first thing, and I think lots of our listeners will know this, Hannah, but when you search at Google, you're not actually searching the web, you're searching a copy of the web, right? So Google doesn't take your query and go out and try and find websites that might match the query and wait for those websites to respond, or however you might think about it. What Google is doing is it's what we call crawling the web. So it's going out and it's bringing back a copy of every single resource that it can find on the web. And it's bringing that back and storing that in its vast data centers on the machines in those data centers. And so Google has a copy of the web, And when you go to Google and run a query, what you're doing is searching that copy of the web. So they're building this copy in advance and they're deciding what pages are interesting and what pages aren't interesting. They're storing this in a vast data center, and then they're building what we'd call an index on top of that. We can talk about that in a second, that allows the search process to take place. So we need this thing called an index to be able to find the pages that are relevant within their data center, because you don't want to be, for every query, you type holidays to Florence, you don't want to be looking through every single web page in their copy that's stored in the data centers. You need some way to kind of shortcut that.
Okay, I had no idea that that's how that's working. I feel like you made it sound like everybody knew that. Maybe everyone except me knows that, but I had no idea. Okay, and so how often are they taking a copy of the web?
Yeah, so that's a super good question, Hannah. So the answer is it depends. So
that's always the answer.
Yeah. Let's pick a web page. So let's say, I mentioned at the top of the show, nasa.gov.
Yeah.
Right. So let's imagine the Google crawler, as it's known, goes out and gets a copy of the homepage of nasa.gov and brings that back. So we've got our first copy of it.
Yep.
It's got to then decide, when should I go and get another copy of that?
Sure.
And make some decision. And then if it goes and gets that new copy and brings it back, and it's exactly the same as the copy that it had, then we know we've wasted resources and wasted time because we didn't fetch anything new. We should have gone and got some other page because we've only got a fixed amount of crawling resources available to us.
And crawling, that's a technical term.
Yeah. Basically, it just means going and fetching stuff from across the web.
Okay. Sounds slow though, which is weird, but okay.
Yeah, it is, because websites don't like the Google bot kind of pounding the website, right? So you can consume an enormous amount of resources at nasa.gov if the Google bot turns up and tries to fetch, thousands of pages in a short amount of time. So there's a politeness that these crawlers exhibit. So they'll only fetch at a certain pace, and that's kind of an agreed pace that's reasonable for all websites.
Wow. Okay.
So they kind of crawl along. But the word crawl actually comes from this idea that if you go and fetch nasa.gov, what you'll find in the nasa.gov homepage is links to other pages, right? So you'll see links into pages about different space missions, the team at NASA. Maybe you'll see some links that go off to some other space organization. And so those links are also links that the crawler could go and fetch. And so it will queue those up at some point and decide to go and fetch those. And that's why they call it crawling, is because it's kind of, retrieving things and then going out and retrieving more things based on what it's discovered.
Okay, so there's an element of dynamism in that they would crawl a news website more frequently than a home shopping website?
Yeah. Just back on the nasa.gov example, right? So we fetched it once. We've gone back and we've fetched it again. It's either changed or it hasn't. If it hasn't changed, then why did we do that? We should take more time now before we go and get another copy. So we'll slow down how frequently we're getting it. If, however, we went and got it and it had changed, we'll say, maybe we should get this a little bit more often. And so we'll probably speed up how often we go and get this. And so we're really adjusting what pages we visit based on the behavior of those pages. And as you say, if it's a news site, you probably want to be hitting that pretty frequently, looking for the news that's just in. If it's my homepage, which I don't think I've updated this year.
HughWilliams.com, is that right?
HughWilliams.com.
HughWilliams.com, guys, check it out.
It's pretty boring. Doesn't change very often. Then you wouldn't want to be fetching that too often, right? Because that's a waste of resources.
And was there like a very early version of Google that wasn't this dynamic and just did like a once a day crawl and fetch, and then over time it's gotten smarter?
Yeah, look, the crawling team's been working hard since the late 90s, and it's a big team and it's still innovating a ton. I'll give you a couple of examples of things that are hard, right? So let's imagine that there's a website with a calendar on it. Lots of websites with calendars. I want to book a doctor's appointment, and you can press next. If the crawler goes and gets the homepage to the calendar, it's going to see that next link and it's going to go, there's a next link. I should go and explore that. And it goes and explores that and gets the next month. And then it gets back another link to the next month. And we can end up here for infinity, right?
Yeah.
Because we're just going to keep pressing the next button and we'll end up in some
2047 or something.
Yeah. And so at some level you have to try and understand what the page is, what's worth crawling. Is it a dynamic page? These kinds of things. And so there's hundreds of problems like this when it comes to crawling the web. Dynamism is one aspect of it, but how the pages are structured, what's on the pages, how useful is the page, all these kinds of things go into the equation of crawling the web. It's a super hard problem.
Okay, I have a couple of questions before we move on. So do they store the old copies of the web, and like for how long?
Yeah, they do. They do. I mean, they're not the Internet Archive, so they're not trying to store them for all time for posterity's sake. but certainly they do. And that allows you to compute things like how fast the pages are changing. So if you've got a history of a change of a page of the nasa.gov homepage, then you can compute some kind of trajectory of how much it's changing. And so there's lots of benefits to keeping old pages around.
That makes sense. And then is that kind of like regression modeling, basically?
Yeah, that kind of thing.
And then does more crawling generate more compute and cost more? Like as the world's gotten faster than it was in 1998, is that a more expensive thing for Google to be doing?
No, it's probably got cheaper just because internet bandwidth has got cheaper. And, if you sort of think about a computing resource they had in 1998, I mean, that sort of scale of computing resource is now almost free. So the technology's got a lot better. The internet's got a lot faster. The ability to process things has got a lot quicker. So I'd say overall costs gone down enormously. But on the other side of the ledger, the web's grown enormously.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
I was in a lecture in 1994 with this guy, Ross Wilkinson, this professor from the university I was at. And he got up and he said in 1994, one day there will be over 1 million pages on the World Wide Web. And you could have heard a pin drop. Everybody's like, 1 million pages on the World Wide Web? And, of course, now many, many, many billions. Many, many billions of real pages. And then obviously with these calendar type examples, infinity of pages that aren't meaningful.
Wow. Okay, so Google isn't searching the web. It's searching a reasonable recent copy of the web. But it is live processing my search terms to bring me the most relevant answers, right? That happens in response to my query.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Exactly. And so we mentioned this idea of an index earlier on. So there's this structure that's built inside Google, which is called an inverted index. Not so important, the terminology, but it's a lot like the index you find in the back of a book. So if I'm looking for, I'm looking in a travel guide, I've got a Europe Lonely Planet book and I want to find something about Florence, then obviously I flip to the back. I do a bit of flipping around until I find F. I scan down until I find the word Florence, and then it's got some page numbers that I could go to learn about Florence. So I might say, I go to page 93. And then I just go to page 93 and I start reading about Florence. The Google index is pretty much that. And so they've got all of the words you could possibly search for and then where you would find those words in their copy of the World Wide Web. So anytime you type a query, you're not scanning through all of the pages that they've copied from the web. You're looking in the index and you're saying Florence and say, okay, well, you need to go to this document, or that document. They're the ones that mention Florence. Okay.
And then if you searched Florence holiday, it will look up anywhere that the words holiday and Florence are coming together.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the first step. That's great, Hannah. I mean, that's the first step that Google carries out is it only considers documents that have both the word Florence and holiday in them. And then its job is to what we call rank those. So to try and find the best one of those and put that at the top that's going to meet your information need and put the worst one at the bottom.
And that was what Google was so great at first, right? Which was just relevancy of results.
Exactly. The Google founders, so Larry and Sergey, were students at Stanford. They were PhD students at Stanford. And they were, either the first folks or one of the first folks to come up with this idea called PageRank. Which I'm happy to explain if you're interested in. But it was a pretty interesting idea that really helped the relevance of search, and it was really kind of the IP that the original Google search engine was built around. It turns out over time this has become less important, but ranking was certainly the center of the Google IP.
Okay, so you've teased PageRank, so now you have to tell us what that means.
So I'll try and put it in simple terms for our smart, curious listeners, Hannah. Let me have a shot at it. So let's pick on my homepage. It's not very exciting, but we'll pick on my homepage. If my homepage has links on that page that go to credible resources, that will improve the quality of my page. And so I'm likely to rank a little bit higher on Google. And then similarly, if there's pages out there that point to my page, so imagine, I used to work at RMIT University. Imagine there's a page at RMIT University, it's a credible university, that links to my homepage and says, former academic, Hugh Williams. That will give some credibility to my homepage. And so there's this score that's computed for every page that gives it a credibility score. And, all other things being equal, more credible pages will rank more highly than less credible pages. And so that's the fundamental idea of PageRank.
Okay, so 2 questions. One, when you say credible links, we really just mean volume of links, right? Like it's not testing if it's a credible website based on if it's .gov or something. It's just saying more links mean more credibility?
No, it's both. It's both quantity and certainly quality. So there's a score that something like a nasa.gov would have that's incredibly high. And then if there was, my something.biz, it's going to have a very, very low credibility score.
So there's somehow filtering for the type of website. And then this can be gamed, right? Like, can this be gamed in some way? Like, even if it's not the most credible resource, if you go for a volume play and I create a website, annaclaytonlangton.com, and then I just make another 1,000 websites and point them all at it, will I rank higher?
In the old days, Hannah, that would have worked fantastically well, but that will absolutely not work today. And that's because the Google team has what we call a spam team. And the spam team's job is to detect these kinds of activities. And they're a very, very busy team trying to figure this kind of stuff out. But one thing that would happen here in this case is you'd register a whole bunch of domains at the same time. They'd know that.
Okay.
You'd generate these pages at the same time. All these pages would suddenly appear that were all pointing to your page. They'd all be a bit similar in these kinds of ways. And so they would sort of see that using their algorithms, and they would, basically crush that out of their ranking process. But these teams are very, very smart. Again, they've probably been working as long as the crawling team. So, go back to the late 90s, big team, really smart people, and their whole job is to make sure that the results aren't spammed. And so that you're really seeing great results, not results that have been artificially boosted.
Okay, so there is such thing as spamming, which is bad, and I won't make a website of my name and point 1,000 other websites to it. But there is something called search engine optimization, otherwise known as SEO, and that is completely fair game, right? And as I've understood, that is understanding how the Google search or the ranking is working behind the scenes. And like, I have a friend, that's her whole job, is she advises companies how to optimize their SEO because they want to be more relevant in search results for potential customers. And that's all fair game, right?
That's all fair game. And if you go to the Google website, they have webmaster guidelines, and those guidelines are, the set of things that are good practice that you ought to do in order to make sure that your web page will rank highly. It says all kinds of sensible stuff like make sure your page is really fast.
How do you make sure your page is really fast?
Oh, now there's a
okay, we don't have to answer. Okay,
it'd be a good episode one day. Yeah. How to make the web fast. But I'd say, to my taste, SEO often is in that grey area. So there's a set of things you should do that are clearly obvious, like make your website really fast. And then there's a set of things like you should mention lots of keywords that you'd like to get searched for. And what you find often is that people will stuff all those keywords into the footer of the page. And, Google would probably tell you that's not best practice because you're just trying to game search. You're not actually really trying to deliver great content. And so there's a pretty grey line between what's good practice and what you'll be punished for.
Okay, and if I call back to our LLM episode from last season, I imagine that there's like a human in the loop validation of the rankings, or at least there was at some point. Like, how does that all fit in?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, all of these companies, not just Google Search and Bing Search, but all the companies that are running search do human evaluation of their search results. And so what they'll typically do is they'll sample what's called their query logs. So they'll go and look in all the queries that, getting 100,000 queries a second, go and randomly sample some of those queries, different geographies, different languages, all these kinds of things. And then they'll check what results the customer saw, and then they'll send that query and those results to a human judge, and they'll ask the human judge to assess those results and give them some feedback on those results. And they typically do it in two ways. So one is result by result. So this was the first result to holidays in Florence. Is this any good or not? And they'll give it a score. And then they'll look at the second result and so on. And then they'll also look at the whole page, and they'll say, is this whole page relevant to this query? And they do this on an industrial scale. So we're talking millions of queries, hundreds, if not thousands of humans over the world, working full time, feeding this data back into the system. And it's used for two things. One is sort of diagnosing issues. So what are customers struggling with? What should we work on? So we might hand out a whole bunch of queries to these users, and we might learn that we're not very good at chemistry queries. And then we might say, hey, I'm a PM on search. I think we should be better at chemistry queries. And we might start a work stream. So just diagnostics of what we're good and not good at is one thing. And then the second thing is it makes valuable training data. So if you're going to train your machine learned algorithm, we talked about that in season 1, then you need training data. And so this is a great way to harvest huge amounts of training data.
Okay, I have at least 2, maybe 3 questions. So the first one is, they're still doing that today. Like, they're still doing this industrial scale human evaluation of the results?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and are they looking at like results where no one clicked through, and that might be a flag that the results aren't so relevant, or a search where someone clicked like the 6th link, which I assume you want it to be like 80% of your results they click on the first, and then maybe like the next 15% they click on the second, or something like that?
Yeah, look, a couple of things there. So I'd say by and large, if the user doesn't click, we call that query abandonment. That's an interesting thing to go and study. But there's also queries that users will abandon and be happy. So if I say, time in San Francisco is my query and I press enter and I get the time, I'm probably really, really happy I didn't have to click on anything. So there's certainly a class of queries where no further click is happiness. But by and large, for most standard queries like your holiday to Florence, if I don't click on anything, that's probably a sign that I'm not happy and, definitely worth some PM at Google studying.
Okay, and we mentioned machine learning. So the Google search algorithm will be machine learned. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. And look, we talked about PageRank. So that's what we call one feature or factor that's considered in the giant ranking order. So we talked about this, back in season 1 in our 6th episode, Hannah, our first one on AI. But it's machine learned and there's lots of different factors or features. Something like PageRank is one of those features, but there's literally thousands of features that are considered when you type in a query and you get this answer back in 200 milliseconds. And the ranking algorithm itself is machine learned.
And nowadays you also get the summary, AI generated summary at the top. I don't know whether that's a rabbit hole for now, but I presume that's massively changed the desired user behavior because often you'll get what you need from that summary, which I presume pulls from those web pages. Yeah,
exactly. And look, I think, Google's doing some super innovative stuff in doing that. And that's really hard to do at the industrial scale that Google's operating at. So they're operating at an incredibly large scale and trying to return those AI summaries in a time that's similar to the search results. Takes a little bit longer. You can kind of see it bubbling in and a little bit slower. But boy, is that an industrial scale, hard problem to work on. But it has some negative consequences. So first of all, people are clicking on the blue links less because they're finding the answers there and the blue links are pushed down the page. So websites are getting less traffic, which obviously people care about. So if you work at a business where you're counting on traffic from Google, you're now going to get less traffic. So that's a problem. These AI generated summaries, as we well know, we talked about that back in season 1, hallucinate. And so what you are getting back at the top there is, likely to be reasonable, but definitely fallible.
Okay. So the ranking and some of the machine learning in there is obviously super important to the relevance of the response to my information need, to use the official term.
Nice.
But what else? Is there anything else going on behind the scenes that we might not recognize at surface level?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot going on. We talked about auto-suggest earlier on. That's a pretty big deal. But there's this broader field called query understanding that's pretty interesting. When I was working on Bing in the sort of 2005, 2010 kind of period, we created a team that worked on query understanding, and it became actually as important to helping users with their information needs as the core ranking team. So probably equivalent. I'd say probably the experience at Google is this query understanding thing is just as important as the machine learning and the ranking.
And is that because we're giving it 2 words and we want it to know exactly the context in our heads, but actually those 2 words could hold very different meanings in different contexts, if I'm to guess? Okay.
Exactly. Let's pick a couple of examples, right? So if you turn up to Google and you type bus and press enter, I'd say like the 90% case is you want a bus timetable. You're out and about on your phone, you type bus, you're probably standing near a bus station or you want to find out how to catch a bus, right? So the results that you'd want are going to be pretty different to somebody who isn't in London. Somebody's in Barcelona, different set of search results. Somebody who's in Mumbai, different set of search results. And so the query understanding team's job is to say, hang on, this is a local query.
Yeah.
This isn't a general query. This isn't Taylor Swift, right? This is a query that's local. So then they have to develop techniques to make sure that you get local answers, right? You're not getting the best answers for bus from across the web. You're getting the best answers for bus when you're in Mumbai.
Okay. And that's an example where the location is the relevant attribute for that search. But I might be searching for jeans, and then it might want to pull on other attributes it knows about me, such as my age and gender, rather than my location. So is query understanding basically knowing what levers to pull to make the query relevant based on what it is you're searching?
Yeah, exactly. And it could be trying to figure out phrases within the query. So knowing that when you're searching for jeans that you mean a particular brand of jeans. So some kind of phrase that's pulled from your query. It could be understanding your query's local. It could be correcting spelling mistakes in the query. And of course, they've got a lot more common as people use smartphones.
Yeah.
So, back in the day, you could pretty much count on when people were using a laptop that they'd always get the first letter right.
Yeah.
And then they might mess the word up. Today, you can't even count on that. Spaces
mine are
missing.
so bad. Yeah.
All kinds of things. And Google's magic at that.
Yeah.
So the query understanding team, if you like, is sitting on top of the ranking team, and their job is to try and turn the query into a better query. They can even add words to the query. They can take words out of the query. They can put little clues next to the query. all these kinds of things that make it a lot easier for the big Google search ranker to do a better job of answering the query.
Can we do a few more examples? Because I think they're quite helpful.
Yeah. When I was working at eBay, different search problem, Apple released the iPad.
Okay.
Super cool, right? So
very cool.
One day there's no iPad. Next day, suddenly this new word exists. And boy, did we screw that up. If you went to eBay and you typed in iPad, we would say, here's some results for the query iPod.
Oh, no.
Because we were really, really sure that what you meant was iPod, right? So there's probably enough users out there in history who'd accidentally put an A in instead of an O. And so there was no way we were going to show you iPad results.
Because that wasn't a thing.
Wasn't a thing.
That was a typo.
Yep, we were really sure that you meant iPod. And so, I got a call from the boss's boss and he kind of said, hey, there's all these customers who want to buy an iPad and we're showing them iPods. Like, what are you guys doing?
Please fix.
Yeah. And so we learned, the really hard way that we needed to have some overrides in the system. You couldn't just rely on history to do the query understanding and the correction. You have to have some overrides where you can quickly deploy the idea that this word should not be corrected. And then all of a sudden we started to show iPads to customers who wanted to buy an iPad.
Who's buying an iPad from eBay the day it comes out? Someone who missed it at the store?
Yeah,
and then,
exactly.
Okay.
So, people are, it's like ticket reselling, I suppose. People would go and buy a bunch of these things and then list them on eBay at a premium and people were happy to buy them because that was such a big deal when they came out.
So how quickly were you able to fix the did you mean iPod?
I think it was a long night for the team because we'd never needed this feature before. This had never happened to us. And so it was a long night, probably in the order of 6 to 8 hours before we had a fix out.
Wow.
And then we had to build a feature that allowed us to do this anytime. Well, we could do it in seconds in the future when a new word appeared. But again, this is part of the query understanding team's job is to make sure that the right queries are corrected, the queries are annotated in the right way, these kinds of things.
So there is some commonality between how Google search works and how like local proprietary search will work at some of the big companies. So like Instagram, Amazon, eBay, etc., ASOS have their own search engines and those will all have similar features to what we just described.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's probably a pool of, let's call it 500 people out there around the world who've worked on search at an industrial scale. And those people move between companies and they're pretty well sought after, right? So if you're TikTok and you're looking to build search, you probably go and recruit some of the people who've worked at Google or on one of the other large search problems. You get them over to TikTok. And of course, they're going to do, many similar things to the things that they've done previously.
Makes sense. And then there are this is a cool thing that listeners not in the industry might not know, but there are also third-party products that provide search engines. So like Algolia is an example of that where a smaller retailer might just use Algolia's search rather than building their own.
Yeah, and look, one of the big mistakes that I think mid-tier companies make is they say, let's start our own search team and build our own search engine. And that's not a very good idea. I think the only folks who should be building a search engine from scratch are these absolute giants where search is a competitive advantage and you really need to win in search. So, I'm thinking the likes of, Meta with Instagram and Facebook, Amazon with their search, eBay, TikTok, all these kinds of folks ought to hire a search team and build one. I think everybody else ought to just buy one. And Algolia is a popular commercial product. There's another product called Elasticsearch. So you can certainly go and buy off the shelf.
Okay, and we should, not today, but I would be interested in discussing the information query needs of like an Instagram user or a TikTok user versus an Amazon user or indeed a Google user, because probably is quite subtle if you're only giving it like 2 or 3 words, but the needs are fairly distinct.
Yeah, absolutely. And Google's a general search engine that's there for searching the web, right? And so lots of people have thought about the types of queries that are run at a general search engine. And really, if you zoom out enough, there's really 3 buckets of things that are going on. So first is what we call navigational queries. So that's where you type Microsoft into Google because you want to go to the Microsoft homepage, right? That's easy, navigational queries. There's a second query called informational queries where you want to find out information about something. And then there's a third set of queries, which are what we call transactional queries, which is where you want to carry out some kind of action like buy something. And they all roughly fall into those kinds of categories. But then if you pick on something like an Amazon, obviously it's pretty much all transactional, right? There's a little bit of informational. I'm trying to read some reviews about things, but it's not a great place to do that. So most of the time, it's just transactional queries. People aren't trying to navigate the web when they go to Amazon. So different search engines in different companies are, tuned, if you like, to do different tasks, which may not be as general as the Google search engine.
Okay, makes sense. But like Bing will be very similar to Google Web.
Yeah.
And back to information queries, I imagine a lot of this has been disrupted by the likes of ChatGPT and Claude, etc. And like, is it controversial? But surely Google search has peaked because I'm taking, I would say like 70% of my, let's call them information needs to ChatGPT now. Sorry, Google, but I am.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're maybe leaving that 10 blue links era. It's an era we've all grown up with, but I think we're past that now. And I think the wonderful thing about the large language models, whether it's ChatGPT or Claude or whatever it is that our listeners are using, is that they have so much context about you. And we've talked about that in other episodes, right? So they're saving memories about you. And so you can really have a dialogue about the information need that you have, and you can kind of go back and forth and kind of refine the information needs you've got and get, fantastic answers for your trip to Florence. Whereas Google's a bit one and done, right? Like you go there, you type in your query, you press enter, fifth of a second later, you've got some blue links, maybe an okay AI summary, but it's just based on that query. And that's not as good as what the LLMs are offering today.
But I also would wonder if we're at like the peak LLM experience, because they're not yet bombarding me with ads. But at some point, I assume they need to make money. And so they're going to be putting those in. So I'm getting like the best service from the LLM for free for now, basically, right? And so it's pulling me off of Google. But if that starts to be disrupted by other things because they need to monetize it, then maybe I will end up back at Google for certain searches.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the nice things about Google is that they really clearly separate what's an ad from what's not an ad.
Yes.
Right. So they're very clearly labeled. I'd say they've dialed down the separation a little bit more, and maybe not quite as pure as they once were, but it's still pretty clear what's an ad and what's not. And certainly you can't buy placement in the Google algorithmic search results, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you just have to do the right kinds of things and let the algorithm look after it. And there's a bit of a church-state separation at Google between the ads team and the search team. So the ads team really has no influence over how the search team does ranking. And the search team, I guess kind of just puts up with the fact that the ads team is going to put ads in part of the Google search results page.
But I also like that on Google, you can navigate specifically to the shopping page and then look specifically and compare different products from different websites. Be interested to see how the LLMs answer that need in how they build out their search results, because it's pretty bog standard how you get your response from the LLM right now. Like sometimes they'll offer me a table, which can be helpful if I'm looking to compare, but I don't know how they'd work in shopping. And it's all trying to be like your friend. And so that whole idea of like a friendly LLM trying to sell you something feels like it will be like psychologically quite strange, whereas Google's pretty cut and dry, right? Like here's where you get your photos and here's where you get your shopping results or Google Flights or whatever it is. So yeah, I'll be interested to see how that evolves.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the LLMs today have really nailed that informational query, right? So navigational queries, informational queries, transactional queries, they really nailed the informational queries. I think it's going to be pretty interesting to see what they do in the transactional queries when it comes to things like shopping, booking trips, these kinds of things. Not really clear exactly how that'll work. And again, as you said earlier, not exactly clear how they'll delineate between ads, what's an ad and what's not an ad. But it's going to be one heck of a business model when they turn it on.
Yes, although I would say that my innate trust in Google is pretty high. I don't know whether that's a good thing or not, or naive, but I have pretty strong trust in Google and the robustness and the veracity of the results I get. And I wouldn't say the same thing about ChatGPT, at least not right now. Like I think its friendliness almost puts me off. Maybe that's me being very British. But like I'm not sure. Yeah, I feel like it could lose my trust pretty quickly if I felt like they were trying to sell me something without admitting that they were trying to sell me something. And I just like the way that Google's very clear with, if you want to buy, here's where you buy, and it's very clearly an ad.
I think that's spot on. And, props to Google, right, for always keeping their search team separate to their ads team. And so there really is no influence from the commercial part of the organization on what the search team does. And so the search team is very, very pure in how it goes about solving the problems. Back in the old days, if you go back into the 2000s, we were certainly the same at Bing, and Bing is still the same. So the search team isn't influenced by the commercial outcomes. But Yahoo definitely went into some grey areas. So, there was lots of rumours on the street that you could kind of buy placement in the algorithmic results in Yahoo. And of course, that didn't end well for Yahoo. They shut down their search team. They got out of the search game. One of the biggest mistakes in tech history, by the way, getting out of the search game.
So we should definitely do an episode on the biggest mistakes in tech history. But I also feel like we could do an episode on how Google Ads work, because in a similar way to how I think I said in our Is Your Phone Listening to You episode that I quite like that Instagram serves me relevant ads. Like I also do quite like that Google is clearly processing quite a lot of information from myself and users like myself and giving me relevant content. And that would be an interesting thing to break down that I think could be an episode in its own right.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be fun to do a history of ads and the current state of ads. And
and ads is like 70% of Google's revenue or something. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, yeah, so it's pretty big. Okay, so before we wrap it up, let's call back to, I think you did a PhD in search, is that right?
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. And then you were at Microsoft, what, like the early part of the 2000s? Is that fair?
Yeah, mid to late. So 2004, 5 to around 2010.
Okay, so it's been a fair while since you were working directly in search. Are you keeping an eye out, like outside in, on what's changing? Or, I mean, I guess you've got mates that probably still work in the industry, but like what has changed since then?
Great question, Hannah. I think the thing that's changed the most is that we've moved from matching words. So when you type in a query like, holidays in Florence, we're not literally today just taking holidays in Florence and looking for documents that match. What they've really started doing now is really trying to understand the documents and represent those documents as a point of understanding, and then understand your query, represent that as a point of understanding, and try and find things that might match. So, for example, let's say there's a document out there that's about holidays in Florence. You might distill that out to being, a tasteful cultural holidays in Europe. And that might also be near some other page, like say there's a holidays in Vienna. Mm-hmm. You might say, well, that's also a tasteful cultural holiday in Europe. And so those documents would be sort of represented in space as being pretty similar. And then when you type holidays in Florence or cultural holidays in Europe, moved away really from that idea of matching words to now trying to really understand a query and understand a document, sort of distill the essence of those and try and match that. So that's kind of the new frontier of search.
Okay, so there's like a nuance in understanding the informational need, and then there's a richness in the results that's not so cause and effect, search for this, get that, and is more sort of context driven.
Yeah, that's it. So more about sort of intent and understanding and less about literal matching of words.
Okay, and where do you think search is going? Is this just some of what we mentioned before about the advent of the LLMs and how they'll disrupt?
I think that's a big part of it. Look, search on mobile is going to be a thing for a very long time. Do you really want to use an LLM when you're in a hurry to do something on mobile, buy something, whatever it is, book a ticket? Probably not. Mm-hmm. And so I think, search has got a long, long way to run. Google's still getting 100,000 searches a second. But I think we are heading towards a world where maybe it's less typed, more voice, more video, more of a blurring of the lines between LLMs and blue links.
Yep. Okay, that's fair. And to take it back to Google before we close out the episode, in some of my research, the word Google actually holds a meaning, or a very similar word, Google, which I think is what Google was named after, which isn't a type of bird. I made it sound like it's a type of bird, but it's like a 1 with 100 zeros or something, like 1 to the power of 100 or something.
Yeah, 1 with 100 zeros. Yeah, okay. Exactly.
So there's your fun fact. I know we said we wouldn't do any more tech trivia, but I did think that was pretty cool.
Can I wrap by telling you that I got a Google job offer in 1999 and turned it down? Did you know that story?
Oh my God. Is that your biggest regret?
I don't really have regrets. I'm very happy with my life the way it is, and might have gone down a different path. But certainly the piece of paper from that job offer probably would have made me a billionaire.
Oh my! Wait, so you don't still have it, or do you?
Yeah, I do. I think it's in Selena's office in a filing cabinet somewhere. It looks like it was almost typed on a typewriter.
Well, hey, the podcast could still make you a billionaire. You never know.
Oh, you never know. Yeah,
and on that note, guys, if you liked what you've heard today, you can find us at techoverflowpodcast.com. You can listen to more episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And we are on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, and I believe now TikTok.
Yeah, and YouTube Shorts.
Oh, that's new. Okay, great. Like, subscribe, leave us a review. We love your feedback. And please do us a favor and share us with your friends, colleagues, and family if you think they'll be interested, because we got to make you a billionaire.
And pay for the podcast at least.
Yeah. Oh, and a trip to Florence would be nice.
Yeah. We keep using that example. I like it. It's making me want to go to Europe.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, guys. We will see you next time.
Thanks, Hannah. See you. Bye.
Bye.